So fascism requires a kind of in-group sympathy to breathe. It needs that just as its status quo. And so that means that the only way that you can consistently generate in-group sympathy is by having some kind of antagonist, having a mythology with antagonism. And so usually how that's done is done by conflating the past, because there's always some conflict in history, with something in the present. So you have this ongoing historical thing, ongoing structural thing, and that becomes the central narrative and the central touchstone to everything. That is the key that unlocks every problem. That's how the rhetoric works. And so you have to conflate everything into historical representation of groups, so that the group can be alive in the present. So just to have this mentality, you cannot have any kind of non-racialist sentiment. So just at the start of the starting point of the social justice narrative is that non-racialism is nonsense, essentially. And you have to identify with your group, and everyone, in fact, not just you, but everyone is forced to identify with their group. You have to have this kind of collective punishment drive that is the form of the solution. And obviously when you try to implement that in policy, you end up with the most disgusting kind of a reactionary anti-non-racialist policy, which by its own workings has to degrade the integrity and deform the concept of integrity of individuals, because they can only be put right in as much as they are a token of their collective group that needs to either be punished or meted out some kind of reparation. And so every progress is defined in the context of historical reparations in some sense. Now, this thing cannot be managed in any kind of open democratic society. Because when you start trying to mediate, it's perhaps conceivable if you only have two groups to try and work out some kind of collective form of bargaining or something like that. But it's so palpably ideologically artificial that you have to live and breathe the ideology. Everything has to live and breathe the ideology. You have to force everyone to buy into the dogma. You have to force everyone to take on that labeling system. You have to force everyone to completely adopt the language, to completely be possessed by it. And reality doesn't work when you do that, because forcing everyone to be a token of their group is fucking dehumanizing for one, but it also it gets in the way of, because the actual complexity of human interaction is that the biggest problem that people have is their own individual character flaws and their own individual character defects, which need to be negotiated in some way. And if you just have this kind of in-group sympathy against the outside groups or the different groups being tokens of one another, there's no way to mediate that, which can only be mediated through when I say mediate that, there's no way to mediate those defects of humanity that individuals possess, because they've just got that racial narrative to use as a crutch, essentially. So they don't have to face their own defects. They don't have to face their own flaws, because they can just say, you can't tell me that because you're privileged, or you can't say things to me because your group has been XYZ to my group, and I need my narcissism to protect myself. So, and this is in fact, when borderline personality disorders, people with borderline personality disorder as a kind of central theme of their personality style, orchestrate the same level of social manipulation and social politics, with the drama that they embroil in their social circumstances. This is the same kind of strategy that they use to deflect everything off themselves and make it all about some kind of righteous paranoia. This person has broken these standards, these rules, these kind of superficial cultural mores, And so because they have done something improperly, and it's very easy to force people into those kinds of errors. It's the same thing that you see with the race baiting on the radio, on the South African public radio. With the kind of it's too easy to manufacture propaganda for the in-group sympathy, because people haven't found the exact right way to be polite about the double standards. To indulge the kind of racial narcissism that is needed to correct the past. It's palpably ridiculous. But if you try to if you're not polite about it in the right way, because it's such a convoluted doctrine of racialist nonsense, that even when they try to describe it being correct, it only works because they can kind of create this mob group mentality to attack people who don't sing along in the chorus. Anyone who doesn't sing along in the chorus, who's trying to go against this orthodoxy, is promoting hate speech, and they are racist in some fundamental way, because they don't agree with the fundamental racism at the core of identity politics. So unless people are willing to adopt the racism in identity politics, unless they are willing to be racist in that exact way, then they are branded as racist. And unless people are willing to go along with the racist program in the radical social justice ideology, then you are, a representative of structural privilege and whatever else it might be. They have to create a rhetoric which insulates themselves from being able to actually respond to criticism, because they don't have a way. They can only really dismiss the point out of hand by saying that is repugnant. So we cannot. You can't expect me to convincingly deconstruct that, because it's coming from a point of view which is not racist like we are, which doesn't believe that races are essential entities and they are the prime movers in social politics or in the political sphere. And so already, obviously, if identity politics has that at its core, there is no way of getting around it. You're going to have to set up separate states. You're going to have to, basically, it's going to end up having to kind of compromise to the point at which compromise its high principles and ideals, that everyone must have their identity pandered to equally, which, how the fuck is that ever going to be achieved, within a racialist paradigm? The only way is by separate but and equal development. So we have an ideology which has effectively taken over a political establishment. No one has the backbone to face this racism and call it out and deconstruct it, because everyone's trying to play the good moral authoritarian, or let's say the kind of is trying to promote themselves as no, they would be a good moral father to the system, that you just need to they would be the ones to deliver justice for the identity. That's how everyone is rated in this kind of political culture and climate, is who would be the good moral authority to dispense their moral judgment from the position of the political executive, and to kind of have this Napoleonic top-down orthodoxy that is enforced, and that its language is policed upon the state, through the state. It's more than troubling, but so essentially you've got a racist religion that becomes a kind of the state religion, in the secular political orthodoxy, and so this is, but so the only thing that they have to say that they are not Nazis themselves is that they still give lip service, they still give rhetoric to the idea that no, the only reason why we do any of this is just because we want equality of outcome. So they use equality of outcome to shield themselves from the truth that they are actually fascist. But that equality of outcome just gets further and further put into the future, because it's no, we just need to fix the radical problems now, and we need to fix them radically. So it just gets more and more deferred as more and more rhetoric happens about greater structural injustice and greater conspiracies against, the groups. And the only solution against these structural problems is an authoritarian structural tyranny that literally intervenes and controls everything from the top down. And so it implements exactly what it complains about. It is the problem that that it professes to be the solution for. And so the more you give into this policy, the more it doubles down, the more it gets worse, because it literally creates the problems of the rhetoric that it supposedly is the solution for. So the more it's indulged, the worse the problem gets, and the less authentic transformation you get, because you get just more and more of this artificial transformation, which needs to be propped up by yet bigger, whatever it is, bigger policy interventions, and bigger quotas. It doesn't ever clean up after itself. It because it's fundamentally, it's conceived from a policy standpoint as the corruption that we are facing is the ideological corruption of this self-fulfilling racist premised garbage. That the idea that the form of the solution is some form of asymmetrical racism to the historical racism, and then and then because you've already gone that way, now you have to change language, and you have to force everyone to adopt a kind of toxic racial identity in order to justify the use of such stupid policies which make it impossible for small businesses to do anything. So you can't have an authentic economy. You can only have these big corporations and these big conglomerate corporate systems with their bureaucracies that can absorb the kind of quota system, which doesn't have anything to do with authentic networking. In fact, authentic networking and skills development becomes impossible in a society like this, because everyone is forced to treat everyone else as some level of token of their group, or token as being part of their group. And so how can you calculate that into networking? I mean, it's fucking insane. It's impossible to do that. I mean, only the most kind of deluded, racist, and so this is the racism that's at the heart of the social justice ideology. The idea that, and it can only be promoted as a rhetoric when it is the underdog, when it is not politically successful, when it actually gets political control, and all it can actually do is complain more and more because it doesn't actually solve anything. It makes things worse and worse. That the solution is just give them more power, give them all the powers of the police state, take away the rule of law, take away a kind of an open culture. That's all gone. It has to be politically controlled for the purposes of the identity, and giving pride to the identity and giving justice to the identity, when the people on the ground will not be served just because their supposed identity is being served, because they won't get real skills, they won't be empowered. Their identity will be empowered, which is something completely different, which looks like the kind of fake bullshit that even Hitler basically peddled back on when he was, trying to make the poor Aryans feel better about themselves because they're still Aryan, and so let's not indulge in a kind of a class divide, because we must just remember that we collectively give sympathy to ourselves because of the enemies that we have on the outside. It runs thin so quickly, and then you get a kind of patent, disgusting elite within, and it's justified by the outside scapegoats. And none of these issues can ever be intelligently addressed properly, because you can't have an honest debate about them, because as soon as you try to have an honest debate about them, they will say, no, you are speaking on behalf of the enemy identity. You are a representative of the structural oppression of history. So you can't actually intelligently talk about any issue in the present. You cannot talk about it. You can only talk about it in the context of it being the consequence of the past, and therefore we need a political solution that takes the past in its hands, and it says, I will do whatever the fuck I want to the future and the present, because you're all just a token of the past. And you need a political establishment. Well, it's called for a political establishment to treat people like that. And so you have no rule of law, you have no democracy, you have no open society. And in fact, the only way to have any kind of stable mind state is by setting up ethno-states which are separate from one another, so that you can kind of, at least in your mind, you can not be interfered with by these other people, so you can actually just get fucking on with it. But then you're also still in this constant perpetual war, that you're comparing your pride against their pride. It's so fucking petty. All the while, individuals within the in-group will not be allowed to look like anyone in the out-group. They won't be allowed to adopt the culture of the out-group. They have to actually define their purity by not being like the anything else. So then you've ended up giving these ideological tools to demagogues that supposedly promote the interests of your in-group and promote the interests of sympathy with the in-group. But because it is a sympathy cult, you have to keep on sustaining the sympathy, and you have to keep on defining what you're not. And so it always makes progress by defining what it is not and what it needs to remove to not be that way anymore, so that it removes the injustice. It's a cult of defining sympathy by the promotion of fighting injustice. And so it has to fight. It has to fight constantly. And it has to fight with those who don't think that it is a fight. It's actually something that needs to... You need to apply your intelligence to it, instead of this kind of fascistic so-called intelligence of conflating and feeling sympathy with your identity through history and looking at people as tokens of all these things. It's so dehumanizing. Effectively, it reduces people to insects. That they are made hive insects of their collective identity. And then they are forced to be bonded to the elite or the leadership of that, And so you end up having to set up these palaces for the leadership of your in-group, and you are somehow vicariously redeemed through eating off the scraps of the table of your new political elite. And so you can say, oh, well, now our elite is the same color skin as us, so it's all good now. How fucking pathetic is that? And they call this Marxism. It's so patent, thinly veiled fascist philosophy. It's probably it's as fake classical Marxism as Leninism is fake Marxism. Which it is as well. It's that's not even debatable. It's very obvious that Lenin the whole time was deceptive from the start. You could say that he did it for the right reasons if you believe in his particular argument, but we know from history that his argument does not hold water. It is not worth pursuing. That's a Marxist tangent. It's not worth. The only way that Marxism is ever going to actually happen is if it happens as a buy-in private scale within an open liberal society. It doesn't need political revolution. It just needs to actually do what it wants independently of a system, not independently in a radical way, independently in a practical way, in literally just getting on with it. So you want to live in an alternative economic system? Fine, build it. Build it yourself. Buy into it. Is it impossible? Are there no philanthropists who could be spoken to set these things up? Is there not enough private wealth that has been transferred? Are there no so-called communists who have gotten millions and millions of rands? In this transition, could they have not tried to set up an alternative model, not by theft, but not by some kind of state theft and trying to impose an economic model on everything, but literally, and also because it has a political element, to try to impose communism on a state is just retarded in every way possible, because how are you going to deal with your dissidents? I mean, it just doesn't work. You need to have some kind of liberal system as the default system, as the platform to make these things. So you set up, you just try to set it up, not from the top down, but from people who are willing to work together, who are perhaps, and if the state wants to be helpful, that would be nice. Maybe the state could, make some policy to just basically leave them alone, as it were. But I mean, otherwise, it's not impossible to work out a legal way that the state could recognize what you're doing and not be threatened by it. That you're not saying this land now belongs to this commune. No, you just fucking make it an NGO or make it a whatever. Like make it a partnership, or make it put it in some kind of legal framework that is broadly encompassing enough. And even if you have to pay some kind of tax on some level, it's not as if you're going to be completely disintegrated from the capital market. You could still trade with the capital market. In fact, if you set up any kind of alternative system for a long time, you're going to want some kind of symbiosis. And in fact, it will be better that way, because then you can kind of accumulate the amenities of sustenance. And while you're doing so, you can do so more easily by trading, rather than having to displace everything and replace the functioning of everything from the top down. I mean, it's just completely absurd. And it only works if you have some kind of authoritarian power that's capable of taking responsibility for everything. And no one wants that. And if they do want that, I mean, they're historically uneducated. And psychologically, I would even say they're probably just incredibly deluded, and they know very little about the human condition. But a kind of modern Marxism, there's nothing wrong with it. It could, I mean, classical Marxism, left Marxism, liberal Marxism. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's not that hard to devise an implementation of it. Some, what's it called, like horticulture with. Is that the right term? I believe it's the right term. I know. I can't remember. Is it called permaculture or something? The one is the class, and the other one is an example, or a particular envisioned version of that. But something along those lines, set up freely by people who want to work together, who are setting up some kind of system to do that. And maybe they'll fail, maybe they'll succeed, maybe they can be used as a model of success in what they did right, and other things can be experimented on, that you could have more than one model of this. In fact, that would be a much more stable political situation eventually as well, because people would want stable neighbors, and they would perhaps, help other people replicate the success. And perhaps even they would all want to sustain a general market between them, and have some kind of fixed trading system, or at least some, where it was appropriate, where they agreed to it anyway. But I mean, this is not even relevant to the South African context. I mean, the South African context is just don't become fascist in the short term or medium term. Have some kind of sane politics, the kind of open liberal society in which you can even start to have a discussion about interesting alternatives. But the idea that you're going to have some kind of top-down fatherland that's going to fix things for the identity, I mean, it's just so patently disgusting. That you're going to infantilize an electorate and take away all their responsibility, and say you're going to protect their dignity by infantilizing them. You see, it's just so patently absurd on a principled level. It's so hollow and superficial that then obviously it has to be violent in guarding its, putrid rhetoric, so that it can sort of protect its own hypocrisy. And so it has to generate hypocrisy that it protects, because then it has something to fight.